Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships, healing from these relationships. And I've gotten quite a bit more questions about people managing aging narcissistic people, most often narcissistic parents. And we're going to talk a little bit about a theme related to older narcissistic parents or older narcissistic people, especially managing emotions like pity and guilt. So that, again, narcissistic person gets older, what happens? So by and large, aging and processes associated with aging, such as dementia, not all older people get dementia, but a subset do. Aging as well as dementia can result in a magnification of that baseline narcissistic personality, and certain features like oppositionality, entitlement, a lack of awareness of anyone outside of them. Some of those features get worse than they were originally when this person was younger. And this can cause all kinds of problems for families who are struggling with figuring out how to care for this family member, because they may burn through family caregivers who don't want to do it anymore, paid caregivers, even care facilities. And it can then result in sort of a replaying of the grief of having spent a lifetime managing this person. And now, because this narcissistic person who's older may not be mentally and psychologically sound, some people say they feel like, oh, my anger feels misplaced, the emotions feel confused, and there can be a confusing cluster of emotions at having to manage a parent that was a source of so much pain throughout your life. And as confusing as this is, many people in these situations will painfully admit and will endure some shame and other negative feelings at saying or feeling this, that they know that the end of their parent's life may end up becoming the only peaceful pathway for their own lives and their own healing. Now, the research on pre-aging personality and impacts on dementia, it's kind of all over the place, and there's not a strong consensus. And we have to recognize that there are also many different types of dementia, and there's also many different types of narcissism. So that means there's sort of no one consistent pathway on how this narcissism younger looks in a person who's older, and certainly a person with dementia older. Now, the tricky piece is that those higher order interpersonal tactics that narcissistic people engage in, such as manipulation and gaslighting and future faking, all of these are not going to be as accessible to a person with significant memory impairments or other cognitive impairments. The difficult personality stuff that might show up in an older person with dementia, that might reflect some of the irritability, do it my way or the highway, don't tell me what to do kind of stuff. That kind of stuff can also result in setbacks in an older person's self-care. And many narcissistic folks have burned most of their bridges by the time they get to older age. So this pushback may mean even more social isolation and less people willing to care for them or help them out. So it may not be the usual intricate manipulation you might have seen in this narcissistic person, but just hurtful throwaway statements like, you never help me, you don't care, you're selfish. Even though the person doesn't feel like they're all together there, those statements still hurt. But what about people when the narcissistic parent does develop cognitive impairments as they become older, but they actually become less combative, perhaps even childlike, and they're no longer as cruelly manipulative or gaslighty or any of those other things? They may not say the mean things like you don't care, and instead you may see a shift into them being more docile or quiet. That is something people say they have a little bit more difficulty with in a different way. Now, folks in these situations will say they now feel kind of guilty for even thinking their parent was narcissistic or manipulative or mean when they were younger. The self-blaming can feel worse. And as you watch your parent become more dependent and sort of fading away, or even believe it, or that it's even kind of sweet, it can be a grief like no other. Because you might think, why couldn't it have always been like this? Were they always like this deep inside? How can I make the most of this time that remains? And all of that becomes a complicated stew of grief and guilt and even pity. Now, there's a subset of folks where that melting of ego that happens, that aging can bring, could result in more of a docile way of being. And that steps in where the narcissism really once was. It's not the norm. The oppositional, angry, defiant stuff tends to be more normal with aging narcissistic folks. And you may also have the grief that the once mighty parent, although they were cruel, is now sort of a gentle but a shell of that formidable self, leaving you wondering if both can exist in the same person, and seemingly no, they can't. Now, this issue of what aging and narcissism look like, let's face it, folks, it's about to hit a fever pitch because lots of things are happening in society at the same time. Baby boomers are getting older. Their children are also managing their own children. They're a real sandwich generation in a really tricky world. And we're all still trying to figure this out. Some of you may just be getting and figuring out your parents' narcissism. And then just as you figure that out, you might be facing a whole new set of shifts as they become older. And if you did go, for example, no contact with a parent or a family system, and now are being called forth to step in to help coordinate care, these shifts can be far more vexing. And all I can say is be very gentle with yourself as you navigate this. There's really no playbook for this. And as always, multiple things can be true. Your narcissistic parent may have raised you in a manner that subjugated you and left you full of self-doubt and self-blame. You may have found that because of that subjugation, because of that self-blame, because of that self-doubt, that led you to make decisions in your life that could have made all of this worse. You may have detached from them, and now this very parent is transforming into someone you no longer know how to interact with, particularly if they have softened. You may be very tentative. Listen, we don't get to turn the clock back, and healing and moving forward means making choices that also account for you and what you've been through and aren't still an ongoing full subjugation to them. If your parent does become more combative and difficult as they become older, in some ways, strangely, the decisions may feel a little easier, and you may just feel done with them. But if it goes the other way and they become softer and gentler, it becomes very complicated. Remember, all along, you were never responsible for their behavior. And how you proceed with any caregiving is deeply personal. Try and find ways to shut out the voices of the enablers, get your own therapy, and recognize that as with all narcissistic relationships, there is no choice here that will ever feel completely right. We want it to be a formula, and the formula would be much easier, that the narcissistic parent gets more and more brittle and difficult as they get older, in some ways almost making it easier to let go of them and then work through your grief even after they pass. But that's not always the case. And many people will say a once formidable, booming, demanding, boundary-violating parent becomes someone very gentle and quiet that they no longer recognize. As I said, while that might seem easier than an oppositional, angry parent, a lot of the other negative feelings like pity, guilt, and even shame can be equally destabilizing. And so if you did have a narcissistic parent, be prepared that their aging, whether or not they develop dementia, is often going to represent a new and challenging process in the guilt and grief of this process. And always, always remember to be kind to yourself as these processes unfold, because goodness knows you are owed a lifetime of it. Thanks again.